particular point later on in time. Today we're joined by four speakers. We had a fifth speaker who's unable to present, and I'll explain why when we come to share her remarks. But I'm not going to speak for much longer. I would like to instead introduce the first speaker, Sarah Snada. Sarah is an international development and humanitarian expert, a professional who's worked in the sector for almost 15 years. You can read her bio details in the pamphlet that we shared on Humanitics for more detail, but I don't want to waste any more time speaking. I'd like to hand over to Sarah. Sarah, and I will share your slides.
Thank you, Samanti. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of this land and pay my respects to elders past and present. I make this acknowledgement not as a formality, but because land, survival, and resilience are deeply connected. The story of endurance here echoes the resilience of my own people in Sudan. My name is Sarah Snada, and I'm here both as a Sudanese woman and as an Australian woman, deeply aware of the privileges of being able-bodied and being here today. Professionally, I'm a food security specialist with over 15 years working with the United Nations, the World Bank, and international NGOs mainly on humanitarian projects in conflict and post-conflict settings. But I also come with strong personal ties to Sudan. My family, friends, and community are living through the crisis I'm about to speak about. I carry that with me in every word you'll hear today. I want to start with a story. The story of my childhood friend. His name is Mustafa. Mustafa is a doctor. He's married to a doctor. They both lived in an area of Sudan where there were no emergency response rooms or community kitchens. For those familiar with Sudan, they were in Omdurman, Khartoum. Emergency response rooms are basically neighborhood volunteer hubs. They coordinate everything from local aid, evacuations, and first aid to small community kitchens that cook and share the meals for families who have nothing. In my friend's area, none of that existed. Markets were often empty. And when food actually appeared, it was 10 times more expensive than before the war. Banks weren't operating, so even if you had money, you couldn't access it. They stayed because they were caring for very fragile and elderly parents and grandparents. But there came the day when their children's breakfast, lunch, and dinner was sugar on bread and black tea. Because that was all they had left. And those were absolute luxuries. Eventually, with very heavy hearts, they made the difficult decision to risk the dangerous land journey to Egypt. And I share this story because it is Sudan's story today. And I want to say something about the words we use. I will describe this as a man-made famine. I recognize that can sound gendered, but in Sudan, as in most of the world, these crises are literally man-made. They are the product of wars, greed, political choices made overwhelmingly by men. This famine is a man-made and preventable famine, and it is pushing families to make impossible choices. Now, Samanti, if you could help me move to the first slide. Now, this is a talk about a famine that doesn't really have to happen, about why Sudan is facing the worst hunger crisis in decades, who is holding the country together right now, and why solidarity, your voice, your attention, your willingness to act matters more than ever. Both the stories we tell and the solidarity we build can save lives. Next slide, please. Every year, Sudanese families face environmental shocks. Floods in the south, drought in the north. They are used to some seasonal hunger. It does happen every year. But this famine is different. It is man-made. And the scale is absolutely staggering. Over 25 million people. That's more than half of Sudan's population are facing hunger. And that's like the entire population of Australia, not knowing where their next meal will come from. Climate is only the backdrop of all this, but human decisions are the reasons families are starving today. Next slide, please. This famine has a clear chain of events. First, the conflict disrupted planting and harvests. Then markets and currency collapsed. Prices were 10 times higher than before the war. Banks shut down. People couldn't access what little they had. Aid was blocked. Absolutely dangerous to deliver. Blockages everywhere. I've had family members just on their way from Khartoum to Port Sudan, which usually takes about 7 hours by car, now takes more than 14 hours because of all the checkpoints, all the stops that they have to make, all the harassment, and the checking of every little item. They spoke about how even Panadol is extremely difficult to move from one state to another. So this is only just to give you an idea about how difficult it is getting anything across. Hunger is being used as a weapon. And that is how a man-made famine takes hold. In areas that are controlled by one warring party, it's used as a way of asserting power and subjugation, and also ethnic cleansing elements of that have also proven to exist. Next slide, please. Right now, it isn't the UN or the big NGOs keeping families alive. I wanted to take the time to speak about the neighborhood volunteers, diaspora families, and small community kitchens funded mainly by migrant remittances. They are the heartbeat of survival. We know that we've got at least 10,000 volunteers across Sudan working on these kind of initiatives, the provision of food, first aid, mobile clinics, at a time where majority of hospitals have stopped working and food is in extreme scarcity. But the scale of the crisis is a lot bigger than what they can carry alone. Next slide, please. Sudanese in the diaspora are not passive. We are co-responders, sending money, funding local response rooms, keeping kitchens open, running fundraisers where we can and trying to raise awareness. This is what's holding people together, but it is beyond what we can sustain alone. Diaspora solidarity saves lives, but global solidarity is what will end this famine. There's a lot more than needed than just sending money or having small, tiny groups of people talking about this crisis. There's a need for a more integrated approach. Next slide, please. I wanted to speak about solidarity and allocate some time for this because solidarity is not just moral, it's also practical. What we talk about drives what gets funded by our governments. It controls where policy shifts and which borders become open for aid, where diplomacy comes in, and where funding comes in as well. But silence is what allows for famine to fester. The famine in Sudan, we knew about it long before it happened. There's something called the IPC reports, which get issued by UN bodies that make projections about the availability of food in certain places. And there's always different scenarios, but all the scenarios for Sudan were dire when the war broke out, and we knew that it was going to happen. Voices were there speaking to governments, the international community, to intervene, not only with funding but also with diplomatic efforts to allow for humanitarian corridors, get the food across, and to get there and to get intervention happening before the crisis gets to its worst, which it is right now. But sadly, none of that happened, and we learned nothing from the previous experiences, like the famine that happened in Somalia in 2011, where 250,000 people, more than half of them were children, died. And then the UN, NGOs, experts came together, said, we're not going to let this happen again. We've got our learnings. We'll take the right steps before hunger gets to these levels. But here we are, and history is repeating itself even worse than before, with not only Sudan being a hotspot for hunger, but Gaza as well. Next slide, please. People often ask, why is Gaza everywhere and Sudan almost nowhere? Mainly when it comes to media attention. The difference isn't whose lives matter, it's visibility, infrastructure. Palestine does have strong global networks that command geopolitical attention, and its suffering is shared in real time. The fact that we're able to get images, the fact that we're able to get recordings, influencers able to play a strong role there as well. But in places like Sudan, for instance, where the crisis is driven by militias who are also really aware of the power of media, and they basically the word on the street is, if you hold your phone up, you're going to get shot, regardless of what you're using it for. When people see men in uniform, they just get rid of their phones immediately. So the material itself is not there. African crises suffer structural invisibility, media bias, and historical dehumanization added on top of that. But solidarity isn't zero-sum. When we speak for Sudan, we strengthen the global fight for justice for all, and not just Sudan. Next slide, please. As I said again, the famine is preventable. Sudanese families and diaspora networks are fighting to survive, but the scale is beyond us. Your solidarity, your voice, your sharing, your pressure can save lives. Words alone won't feed anyone, but the right words turned into action can. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to end where I began, with my friend Mustafa, who fed his children sugar on bread. Today, his family is safe in Egypt, but millions cannot leave. Many are trapped in areas with no aid, no cash, and no food. Sudanese people are not waiting to be saved. We are sending money, organizing kitchens, keeping families alive, but this is beyond us. There are many areas that have absolutely no kitchens, no way of even using cash. Words won't feed them, but solidarity can. Solidarity that would bring in governments, diplomatic interventions, that would stop sending arms to Sudan, that would allow for at least the diaspora funding to get there and make a difference. Let's make Sudan impossible to ignore. I hope that's what we can end this presentation on. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. As you were speaking there towards the end, I was reminded of the oft-repeated phrase, it seems now, from our Australian political leaders, particularly in relation to Gaza, but it applies here as well, that's happening somewhere else. It's too far away from us to really think about to have it to be visible. But what you're saying is how much, and I think what your narrative and others' narratives will highlight today, is how important and how connected what is happening over there, how connected it is to what is definitely happening in our own country. Thank you again, Sarah. Does anyone want to? I'm going to open the floor to the speakers, and if there's no other questions or comments from the speakers, I would like to pass on to Tasnim. Okay, Tasnim, over to you. I'm really pleased to introduce Tasnim Mahmood Samak. She is a almost finished PhD student at Monash University and a lecturer. She's been a vocal voice for Palestinians in Australia, and she is going to share some of her insights on this issue. Thank you, Tasnim.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you, Sarah. Your words are deeply moving, and yeah, I really respect your work and the message that you're sending. I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So when Samantha asked me to speak at this panel, I told her that it's like famine is, I'm not an expert in famine or any of that, but I can speak to, telling stories and solidarity because that's more my area. And like Sarah said, solidarity requires action and not only words. And stories can help generate that kind of action that we want to see. So I thought I'll just talk about that and the power of narrative as well. So yeah, it's been almost 2 years since the beginning of the genocidal onslaught on Gaza, which now has culminated into a starvation campaign of Gaza, which is, as Sarah said, accurately named as man-made famine. I'm not someone who can really make lots of comparisons, but I think there's something to be said about how the starvation campaign that is currently being uh, imposed on the people of Gaza has followed, of course, the destruction of Gaza through the warfare of the airstrikes and yeah, the tanks and that was done in the name of self-defense, and it was done in the name of so-called war with Hamas, which of course, has led to the yeah, to what the Israeli officials said at the beginning they were intending to do, which is to flatten Gaza. So that is what they have accomplished. But that doesn't mean that it's final. And that doesn't mean that that they have total control over the events and how I guess the present plays out. So I think that's quite vital. And in that we can center the people in Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, who, within the demolished homes that have been brought down by the Israeli airstrikes, and where there are families who remain under the rubble because there hasn't even been a time in where the bombs have dropped for an effort to be able to be coordinated to remove people from the rubble and give them the burial that they deserve. In the same instance, we see that people of Gaza, when there is an opportunity, they return to these homes, these structures that to them are homes, but of course they resemble, rocks and like broken buildings. And they reconstruct there. And they're very adamant about that. And they say that this is sumud, this is our right to return, and this is our right to live, and our right to dignity. So I think, like the Israeli army, has power and control, but it's not the only actor. And I think like with the famine, that's really important to see as well, because sometimes people people don't stand in solidarity because they have this sense that it's all over and, that like there's no way to stop this. And so that can get in the way. We become passive, we lose the urgency, and we don't act with the sense of emergency that's needed. So with the famine, similarly, it's really important, like Sarah said, to have that video and imagery come out of Gaza, which compels a lot of people. However, at the same time, it can further dehumanize the Palestinians, and we see that with these images of the famine, where people can start to speak about Palestinians in this like deficit way, in a way that you know, assumes that they need help. Um, and there's a lot of dependency narrative because that's what they see in that still image. So all they're seeing is somebody who, yeah, is struggling to stay alive, is hungry, is starved, and all these words are, in many ways, even though they reflect what 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 you're trying to describe, they are dehumanizing words. So, we this is not new. Like we all know this, but in moments like this, we kind of lose the sense of emphasis on like the fullness of the Palestinian humanity, and when there isn't balance, then we can lose that. And I think it's really important to emphasize the way that Palestinians, that they persist to fight for their right to live, and 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 ultimately, if the Israeli plans do become what is executed, and we have that final solution. It's the people of Gaza who are saying, remember us and remember that, we fed each other, that we shared every last food parcel with one another, and that we resisted. So the Palestinians are in battle with the Israeli regime. They are in battle with the Israeli army, and they should be defended. We all say about the right of resist, but really, the the Palestinians are upholding that right, but no one else around the world, because of dehumanization, no one else around the world is willing to back them, and to fight off the Israeli offensive. One way that we can do that is by stopping arms to Israel, so that when the Israeli army has the plan and the ideology and the willingness to exterminate a population, at least they will run into a problem called not having enough ammunition. And that has stopped armies before. The issue here with the Israeli army is that they had, and maybe this is quite unique and historical, is that they have an endless flow of supplies. And so, how much, there's nothing really getting in their way, to continue with this onslaught. They have impunity, they have mass propaganda. So, all these factors that enable mass atrocities are there. The only thing that can really get in the way of that is coordinated action and solidarity. But for us to be able to achieve that, we really need to believe in the yeah, in Palestinian dignity, in Palestinians having the right to govern themselves, because much of this situation is because the Palestinians were placed under siege for refusing the sovereignty of the occupation. And when we're talking about food, a point that many Palestinians have raised is that in flattening Gaza, they have destroyed their agriculture in Gaza. Um, so it's not only that there's a siege, but now even if there is a ceasefire, the Palestinians will still struggle to feed themselves and to have food sovereignty. And that's all deliberate because it's a way to wear down the Palestinian desire for self-determination and the Palestinian desire to live with decolonization. So everything that's happened in the past 2 years is building towards a dependent Palestinian population and a population that requires to be ruled directly by the Israeli regime, or it's an exterminatory plan where a very small population will be governed because the population is so small that it can be directly governed. And we all know this, and we've had academic after academic, experts, even the United Nations, we've had the ICJ case, all of that saying exactly what I'm saying. However, we're not acting in the way that meets the moment. And I think that comparison can be made with Sudan. I think there's something telling that with such a strong opposition and backlash, we're not able to hold Israel to account. And how about other powers that also are organizing to orchestrate or are already perpetuating genocide, such as in the Congo and Sudan? These are questions for all of our movements. So the Palestine movement, what case is it going to provide for other movements? Is it a case of success? Is it a case that can be emulated? It's really telling that a movement of such organization, such global support is, we've seen over the past 2 years, the situation on the ground go from worse to worse to worse. So it really puts into question a lot of what we do know about movement work, about solidarity work, and we're still trying to figure it out in real time. How do you face such a war machine, and how do you bring such a genocidal onslaught to a halt? And I think that's something that all of us are discussing, whether you're in the Palestine movement and indigenous movement, whether it's Free Kanaki, in the face of what we're seeing, which is the repression and the way that governments are being so expedient in the way that they can simply like push aside thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are on the streets week after week, day after day, causing disruption, which in other cases you would think would actually, make some substantial difference. But of course, as I said, this is something in the present. It's not final. It's not the story hasn't been written, and the ink is not dry. So we are writing that as well. Like we need to be able to put forward something and let that be that Gaza prevails, that there is victory for a population that is besieged, that is starved, and that at the end, a population that remained on their land, and that their annihilation did not proceed. And I think that's like for all Palestinians, that's what we want it to be. And inshallah, that is what will be, that Gaza will prevail in the face of the occupation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasnim. Your words and Sarah's words are so moving, and they're moving not in a sentimental way. They're moving because of the righteous type of anger that we feel in your voice and we feel in your narratives. And this is lived experiences. This isn't something that you're seeing and experiencing today, but it is something that has been ongoing. I would like to move on now to Angie, who's going to present, kind of zoom out a little bit, but mention some of the cases we've talked about today. So Angie Sassano is a postdoctoral research fellow here at Monash, and her research is on food systems and food security. Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. I'll just share some slides very quickly. Yeah, I just want to thank Samantha again, and thank you to Sarah and Tasnim for sharing your stories. And I think, like we said, it really shines a light on the reality of what we're facing. This isn't just something that we can intellectualize in our kind of offices. That often happens sometimes, working on food systems. there can be this dissonance that happens where we just write and be divorced from the reality. And I'm kind of coming today as a settler researcher with a background in food studies. And so I want to kind of build off of this. I'm looking particularly at the famine in Gaza, but a lot of the things that I mention can be easily transplanted to other contexts like Sudan and the kind of targeting of agricultural systems. And so I think building off of Tasnim's point in her little talk there around the destruction of agriculture is really what I'll be talking about now. And the way famines often kind of contextualized from decades-long assaults on Palestinian agriculture and land and food systems, which kind of creates conditions for starvation that we're seeing today. Massacre, where there were deaths of the kind of targeted killing of people trying to reach aid. And also just this morning, there were reports that Israeli forces have destroyed a seed bank in Hebron, which is organized by the United Agricultural Workers Committee, which is a Palestinian offshoot of a food sovereignty movement. And so it shows that these attacks on agriculture, these clear colonial strategies to dispossess and foster conditions of hunger and dependence, and to sever attempts at resistance that kind of persist in the face of occupation. And so I just want to start off with these words that a Palestinian farmer and member shared at a food autonomy festival, and he's a member of the UAWC. And he talks about how war and occupation's often looked at through bombs, but there's a slower war that happens in the fields and kitchens, food and land. And that's what we're seeing with this kind of result of famine as a kind of continuation rather than this aberration of a colonial system. And so just to start, I want to bring attention to the media clips and the way the famine's kind of being framed in government responses to it. And we've all kind of come across these. And firstly, there's this kind of tendency to use the language of famine as a way to divorce it from broader kind of political context and kind of structural systems. It's something that's unique to a wartime condition, or it's something that's purely a result of the current kind of Netanyahu government, which decontextualizes it from the experience of occupation since the Nakba. And there's also a concern only for vulnerable populations, this kind of focusing on certain populations that allows a dehumanization of other Palestinians, and that kind of maintains this kind of genocidal logic. And it shows the way that famine is used as a way to curtail responsibility for action towards a genocide. And this kind of on the lower left side is the New York Times article where they just put out the apology for using an image of a child out of context, as though the famine or the hunger that this child is experiencing is different because of pre-existing health issues rather than it being accelerated and exacerbated by the famine. And also just the fact that you're seeing this push by governments using Palestinian statehood as a kind of bargaining chip, and it's conditioned that it's only based on, conditions that the West are kind of applying on what they look like, but what they think Palestinian governments should look like as a way to try to get aid in. And so there's these kind of twisting and manipulation of these political aims here. And in the lower right corner is Ahmed al-Najjar, who's a Palestinian journalist, kind of critiquing this kind of humanitarian approach of, it's fine, you'll have full stomachs, but nothing's going to be done to actually stop the killing. And so what it shows is now there's this willingness to discuss famine as separate or unique from what's happening as a genocide. But UN experts have been talking about this for the past 2 years. In January 2024, UN Special Rapporteurs released a report flagging the experience of famine, and they reported that Gazans made up around 80% of people facing famine and catastrophic hunger worldwide. And they attributed this primarily to the siege that was imposed on Gazans following October 7, but how it accelerated the conditions of the blockade. So under the blockade, half of Gaza's population was food insecure and 80% were reliant on humanitarian aid. And so you can see when you have such a highly dependent population on aid, the kind of political lever can be pulled to stop the aid flow and kind of create these conditions for starvation. And what I guess is important is that the famine, we can understand famine as kind of coming from the way agricultural and food systems are deliberately targeted and systematically destroyed or attempted to be destroyed. And these are some statistics that were released by the FAO and UNOSAT in September last year around what they estimate the destruction of the agricultural sectors being. And so you can see generally across Gaza, over 2/3 of cropland being destroyed through the onslaught that's been happening. And as well, the kind of the destruction of agricultural wells and the water system, which affects the capacity to even grow. What's also really concerning is that in Gaza City, almost a complete obliteration of greenhouses, which is really important to make note of because as an urban area, greenhouses are essential to be able to grow fresh produce. And so by deliberately targeting them, you're deliberately attacking the means for populations to grow food to support themselves. And so what we see is that this isn't just one occurrence, but it's a structural event, and it's something that's been happening for decades. And it's this kind of process of slow death through the experience of what some scholars have called agrarian annihilation. And it explains how famine isn't a novel or unprecedented occurrence, but rather an acceleration that's built on these conditions of targeted agricultural violence. And so, generally speaking, I mean, you can go back to the armistice lines that were drawn in 1949 and how that systematically dispossessed Palestinians from arable agricultural land. And so, already a platform was made for the dispossession of people from land to support themselves and to have kind of food sovereign systems and have a connection to culture. And on top of this, specifically from the 1980s onwards, really heavy trade restrictions have been put on place and has forced Palestinians into a captive market. And this is compounded by different policies of dumping, where cheap Israeli produce floods the market. This pushes local Palestinian produce to high prices, and it creates this dependency on Israeli produce and dismantles the economy and the food system from within. And there's also the criminalization of certain food practices across Palestine. So in the late 70s, there was the criminalization of foraging of za'atar, and it was made punishable by fines or imprisonment. And this is extended to other plant varieties, which not only debilitates the economy, but controls what Palestinians are able to legally eat. And this is really obvious in the case of the blockade in Gaza, where Israeli policies to basically artificially construct a famine. And Israelis kind of restricted food entering Gaza through a daily humanitarian portion, and they calculated it to ensure that they would still get enough food that they wouldn't have hunger or malnutrition, but there would be indiscriminate pressure on the population. And so already we can see, like historically, these levers have been pulled for the famine to occur now. And assaults and aggression in Gaza has led to the closure of food production plants, or they're operating at far reduced capacities. Military operations always targeting farming land. So Operation Cast Lead in 2008 almost caused a complete destruction of Gaza's smallholders and uprooted mature fruit trees, and then continued assaults so those trees couldn't be replanted. And the same is happening in West Bank, where Area C, which is Israeli control, they occupy much of Palestinian farmland in the territory. And with the acceleration of land grabs and illegal settlements, half of the land that's being seized is agriculture. And this is specifically in the Jordan Valley, which is seen as Palestine's breadbasket. So again, these like targeting of the agricultural sites to dismantle food systems. And there's also links between agriculture tech that's being developed in Israel and military development. And agriculture is this kind of testing zone as well for military technology. But just to finish off, while food is oppressive, it's also a site of resistance, and Palestinians aren't passive and are always engaging in food acts as a way to resist against the occupation. So this is a quote again from the same Palestinian farmer that I began with, and he says, "Food is life, and in Palestine, food is also resistance. Planting an olive tree is a political act. Baking bread becomes a cultural revival. Saving seeds is a form of memory and future making. Every harvest that survives the occupation is a rejection of erasure. Food gives people roots literally and figuratively. That is why the occupation targets it. To grow food is to say we are still here. You have not won. You will not erase us." And I think that's important, hopefully, to end with and to kind of reassert the agency of Palestinians to achieve that food sovereignty and avoid these kind of dependent systems. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angie. I'm going to very briefly give an overview of some of the comments that Jada, who was our fifth speaker, was going to make. I'm just going to spotlight myself. Sorry, having a bit of trouble with the. Can you all see me? Probably not. Now you can. Jada is a graduate of the Monash Master of International Development Practice program. She's Palestinian from Gaza, and she actually came to Australia to study at Monash, and she's since graduated and working for the Parliament of Victoria. Jada was going to present, but this is an enormously, I don't actually have the words to describe the lived experience of it, of being in one country and watching what's happening to your loved ones in another in the face of kind of indifference and dehumanization. And both Tasnim and Sarah have touched on this. Both are also highlighting the need for solidarity and the need for greater visibility and the agency of people. It's funny, I'm going to speak as a Sri Lankan Australian now. If you come from a country or a diaspora community where there is a war happening overseas, this is something that we are constantly grappling with, living our normal lives, coming to work every day, but knowing that we're also coming with rage and grief into the injustice. And multiple people probably feel that way. Certainly our First Nations colleagues and neighbours and friends must feel that, very, very, very clearly. But when Jada agreed to actually give the talk, she said she was happy to talk about her personal experiences, and she put together this presentation. It's too much. She can't do it. And, that's fair enough. We also can't expect people to give testimony after testimony, to keep speaking and over again to say the same things without expecting it to impact them. So what I'm going to do is I just want to show a picture of the lovely Jada, this presentation where she began to type it out. She sent it to me so I could read it out loud to you. I won't have the PowerPoint on, but I wanted you to see who she is. And I'm going to very quickly take 5 minutes to read this presentation. She writes, "As a Palestinian from Gaza, this moment is a deeply personal one. For decades, Gaza has been described as the world's largest open-air prison, but today it is a mass graveyard for the hungry. This presentation reflects both my lived experience and my professional background in humanitarian work and advocacy, exploring the structural violence that has created famine in Gaza and the failures of political response. Since 2007, Israel has imposed a land, air, and sea blockade on Gaza, a form of collective punishment in violation of international law. The blockade has restricted the flow of goods, including food, medical supplies, and clean water. In 2012, the UN predicted that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. The 2023 to 2025 genocide escalated this deprivation into starvation. According to the Integrated Food Security Phase classification, famine-like conditions now exist across northern Gaza. Today, my own family survives on almost nothing. This situation eerily mirrors the memories of my grandmother shared about the 1948 Nakba, forced starvation as a method of displacement. And she's also given me permission to share that she's been waiting for her daughter to be allowed out of the country for about a year and a half, and was finally able to arrive with the assistance of DFAT, of course, a couple of weeks ago. As a social worker and caseworker, I've witnessed aid dependency firsthand. Even before the current genocide, 88% of Gazans depended on aid. I personally assisted communities who lived on food parcels of flour, oil, and lentils, and whose dignity was slowly eroded by a system that treats them as statistics, not people. But aid cannot fix an apartheid regime. The current system fails because aid is used to replace justice, not deliver it. It reinforces power asymmetries. Palestinians wait for food while weapons continue to flow into Israeli hands. Humanitarian principles, impartiality, neutrality, humanity, are being manipulated by actors who are complicit in the very violence they claim to mitigate. Famine in Gaza is not an unintended consequence, it is deliberate. Israel has openly admitted this. In 2006, an Israeli advisor stated, "The idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger." In 2023, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant declared no electricity, no food, no fuel. This is a textbook case of starvation as a method of warfare, which is explicitly prohibited under Article 54 of Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, yet no accountability has followed. Aid is a band-aid on a system designed to kill. What's needed is political will to end the siege and allow unrestricted access to humanitarian aid, cease military exports to Israel, hold perpetrators accountable for war crimes and genocide, and support Palestinian self-determination and national liberation, not just survival. Australia must align its foreign policy with international humanitarian law, not US-Israeli military agendas, increase funding to civilian-led aid organisations free from political conditionalities, and support the ICC investigations into crimes. The people of Gaza are not passive victims. They resist by surviving, by testifying, by refusing to be erased. As a Palestinian mother and an advocate, I do not speak from theory, I speak from heartbreak and hope. We must move from charity to justice and from pity to politics. Words won't feed them, but silence will starve them. Thank you so much, Jada, for sharing those thoughts and your reflections, and I'm very pleased to be able to read them. I would now like to move on to introduce Professor Swati Parashar, who has been researching along with her colleague Camilla. I always say, I'm so sorry, I'm going to say her name wrong. Swati, it's Ojula, is it? Orwella at University of Gothenburg. Swati is actually a former colleague of ours, an absolute superstar and a true expert, not only in terms of understanding and contextualizing the history of famine, but of political violence, feminist perspectives, and most importantly, feminist solidarity. Thank you, Swati.
Thank you, Sam. It's such an honor to be here, actually. For a long time, I have not been speaking in seminars, particularly on hunger and famine, because it is exactly what we pointed out, that we are living through this moment, and it's really hard to talk about it. I really appreciated the title that you put in here, that words are not enough, and words won't feed anybody. And I think in terms of just being in academia, you actually watch every day, these seminars, these meetings that we have, we talk, but we know there's a world out there that is not accessible to us. And we are all grieving in our own way. But I also find that these opportunities where this kind of space that you've organized, Sam, is really useful, because I think through our words, we are also collectively thinking and grieving. And I think many of the things we heard just now are extremely powerful. I know that you asked me to also sort of tie that up in what I wanted to say, but I wanted to pick up one or two things that each one of them mentioned. I think for Sarah, what you said is what we are all living through. That is that we are carrying ourselves in this world right now, not just as academics, as researchers, as NGO workers, development experts, whatever that be. We are also located, embedded in communities that are suffering in their own way, and that needs to be considered. When you talked about Mustafa's story, and we are here all here as people, as Sudanese, as Gazans, as Indians, Sri Lankans who have seen the coloniality of famines in the past. So it's important to consider that. I also appreciated most of the comments that talk about our experiences as the diasporic community, as being part of the big diaspora, and what the diaspora is doing to make things livable in these spaces. Tasneem, your point about war being not the only thing, but that there is hunger. I know people think that famine is hunger, is war by other means, but it's important to consider famine on its own as a form of war. It's not just something that flows out of a war. It's not just something that happens because there is a war going on. It is a specific kind of war inflicted on people, which rich and the powerful have always inflicted, and I think we need to consider that. And Angie, I just appreciated this idea of the continuation of the colonial system that you talked about. And in many ways, most of our own work, Camilla and I have also done, is also about famines of the past and how they teach us about how coloniality of hunger works. And Jade, I was totally struck by what you said about famine is not stripping people of dignity. It's not just an act of political violence where bodies are depleting and disappearing and people are dying, but it is eventually about human dignity and what the loss of that causes. And I think deep down, I think all of us are thinking about solidarity not being a zero-sum game. And I think, Sarah, you mentioned that beautifully, that when we talk about one famine somewhere, one catastrophe somewhere, one war, one genocide, we are talking about the links that exist everywhere. So I really want to deeply appreciate the linkages you make between thinking about famine as an actual and brutal act of violence and what that does to humanity, and how we can think about solidarity more broadly. That came through in everything that you said. Now, in most of the work that we have done, Camilla and I, it began with thinking, and it's important to consider that most of my previous work had been on war and how people fight wars, and that had been my thinking for a long time till we came together, Camilla and I. She had been working on transitional justice, and we both sort of thought one day, how is it that we don't think about people dying through starvation and hunger? And it was just kind of something that we debated. Are there other kinds of political violence that we don't think about? Actual violence, not something that is a crisis or considered a food insecurity issue. And this is where I want to tell you all that if when we started our research, most of the references or work on famine looked at the words they used was crisis, food insecurity, climate change, all sorts of words which really didn't talk about that being an actual war waged on people, and that was really striking. Or disaster. This was very common. Disaster, crisis through which famine is understood. And probably if you and I don't sort of work hard to make Gaza and Sudan being talked about as a kind of war against people, they will still be resorting resorted to, crisis and disaster in the years ahead, that there was a war in Gaza and that, there was a genocide unfolding and famine was part of it. No, it is very, very deliberate. And I think we were also in the process building on the work that other people have done, Alex DeWall being just one of them, but so many other kinds of work that have now emerged talking about famines of the past. My own interest grew out of looking at the Bengal famine in India of the 1940s and how the demand for reparation has never been that strong. And you kind of wonder, how is it that certain famines in the past have been more visible? Holodomor in Ukraine, we celebrated, we marked, rather not celebrated, but we marked, I think, 90th anniversary of that in 2023, and we talked about it. And then we know the Irish famine that everyone is familiar with, and I have just posted a link, and I don't have time to talk about it, the Irish famine and its the link to Australia and Australian nation building, how famine afflicted women were transported to Australia, and then they kind of formed families and community here. So Australian nationhood, and particularly white nationhood, how that was constructed through famine bodies. I mean, there is so much rich research on that, and there's a little blog that I wrote that I wish you would see. And, right here in Victoria, just a few, kilometers from Melbourne, I visited the site. There is a memorial site for the women who landed there and were then distributed within the community to populate and to grow the Australian nation. It's such a tragic story of what happened to their emaciated bodies coming in all the way from Ireland. And there's a memorial in Sydney as well. But you're more familiar with that. I will not talk much about it. But what I'm trying to say is that famines are hunger and starvation are deeply connected to nation building, to how communities think about themselves and how they construct, particularly how even the diaspora imagines its own existence. Two things must be pointed out. One, that in the last few years, we have seen not just the fact that so many famines have occurred and there is kind of media attention to it, which wasn't there for a while, but now we are actually talking about it, although not talking about it in the ways that we should. But starvation crimes have also become important in global governance. And you see that in May 2018, we had an addition made to the UN Security Council resolution on civilian protection in armed conflicts. And this kind of building on previous UN resolutions on humanitarian laws, human rights, protecting civilians and especially vulnerable populations. If you look at, we all talk about, Resolution 1325, but for me, Resolution 2417, for the first time, recognizing the need to break the vicious cycle between armed conflict and food insecurity. So I think that is interesting, and to also investigate how the UN has also been paying attention to it. Remember that 1325 came after a lot of efforts. So for us to continuously talk about it in discourse, who knows that we will perhaps be talking about food security and starvation as on the agenda of global governance to be talked about. So that's one thing. And the other thing, as you know, that in 2020, the Nobel Peace Prize went to World Food Programme. But we don't see anything taking off from there. It was a big moment for those of us who were studying famines and hunger. We thought, okay, World Food Programme is doing good work, but how do we sort of think about it in terms of the wider work on famines and starvation? I'm not going to go into details because I have written a lot on this topic, and some of which I have shared here. There was a Third World Quarterly issue that you could look at. There are a number of papers published on different famines in different parts of the world, ongoing, and also especially in the past, and how we have thought about justice, how we have thought about diasporic activities, and how do we remember famines. Remember, war is always also about how we remember wars to seek justice. So how do we remember? How do we memorialize hunger deaths, and how do we think about justice through that? But let me very quickly talk about, why is it that in common discourse about war and political violence, why have we not talked about famines? What is it about about famines that is really something that doesn't make us use the word violence or war. And this is something that we have been giving much thought to. One is that when we talk about, violence, pain, and mourning, particularly in meta-narratives or in philosophical terms, we have ended up, avoiding specific reference to the human subject and their physical experience. So when we talk about discursive violence, and you can disagree with me, and there's a lot of this in academia and academic and scholarly discourses. We talk about violent disposition, violent reproduction, violent erasures, epistemic violence, but really talking about people, the disappearing, dissolving, decimated bodies somehow have been pushed into the background because we have brought discourse so much to the forefront. I do work with discourses, but I think that is something that I find particularly stark. The other thing about it is that there's an exceptional violence, which is always talked about. War is an exceptional violence. It's a mediatized spectacle. There is a public and even scholarly tendency to view violence as something exceptional, something outside the ordinary. And remember, people dying in wars, it's an ordinary thing. I mean, who cares about a few emaciated bodies? I mean, people are malnourished everywhere, and they don't die immediately. Remember, they don't die immediately. So how do we think about exceptionality? The other thing, which all of the other speakers have also talked about, and that's my third point, is famine as outside violence, right? It's a byproduct of other kinds of violence, but not necessarily treated as violence that is on its own an act perpetrated on vulnerable populations. It is seen as something that is part of the wider violence or the byproduct of other kinds of wars that happen. And that is how we talk about it, whether it is whether in Yemen or Tigray or Sudan and Gaza, right? We all talk about it in that sense. The fourth point that I want to make is also something that feminist scholars have paid attention to, that there is a feminization of bodies in war that we talk about. So if it's not blood and gore, which has a kind of masculine connotation, if it is emaciated bodies, then we don't sort of pay attention to it. And think about famines, right? I want you all to imagine famines and the images that you see. Emaciated bodies of women and children and men who are so shrunken that they look very much like women. So there's a kind of feminized imagery around famines, which makes us, not talk about them in the same way as we talk about smoke and destruction of material things and mutilated bodies of war. So it has not grabbed attention in that sense, because you don't talk about blood there, you don't talk about valor, you don't talk about gore here in the same way, right? And there are no brave people in famine, right? You're not talking about heroes and losers and winners in famine, right? So how do you, and it was a good point that I think somebody made about one of the speakers about famine as resistance. I mean, remember that from Gaza to Yemen to Sudan, people, and even in the past, they have not endured famine without resistance. Do remember that people don't just die, even with their emaciated bodies, they resist. And they do so in many different ways. The fifth point, very quickly, famine occurs in inaccessible, invisible geographies. And I loved it when Sarah said that let's make Sudan count. I don't remember the exact words, but let's make all of these cases so visible through the way we talk about it that we are not able to forget what is happening. So it's important to think about famines not as outside, not just in inaccessible, invisible geographies that we can just sort of forget, right? We can remember Live Aid and Ethiopian famine, but we just all the time associate famines with Asian or African societies, and the shame and the kind of poverty that is associated with it. But we actually say that all of us Western countries are complicit. I mean, what is happening in Gaza and Sudan is not just what is happening there. All of us, all societies are complicit. So it's not just an invisible geography that we're talking about. Very quickly, famine as silent violence. As I said, it is silent violence, but people have been resisting for a number of years. And in any famine, if you read the stories, and it's important to tell you what our methodology has been, people have not written about famines in the way we imagine. We are drawing from poetry, art, literature, memoirs of people to understand what people have gone through. And it's really important to take cognizance of this silent violence. Cascading violence, I did see Bina present amongst us, but Bina and John Braithwaite's wonderful work and how it cascades, right? How it relates to different kinds of violence. And we are thinking through that, particularly colonial histories. Look at Gaza, look at Sudan, how much of coloniality is embedded in that. And then finally, also to think about famine as household violence, right? Most of the images of famines take away its politics. And I think the last comment was about Jada talking about bring politics back to discussing it. Look at the images. It's household, right? It's always something that's happening in the house, but there's no politics. There are children, there are women, there is the familiar scenery of the house where people are starving with no idea of who's accountable for them, who is actually committing these acts of atrocities. The memorial in Sydney, if you go to, it's there in Hyde Park, which I've been to several times. It's right there, and you see the Irish famine commemorated. It's the image is of inside the house, the shelves, the potatoes, the spade, the table, the ladle, the spoon, the bowl. It's represented through that. So it gives you a sense that people just died inside homes, but that there was no accountability. So we are pushing through for greater accountability through this project, and I'm sure there's so many other scholars and activists thinking through that. And the contribution that we have made is talking, at least we hope we have made, is talking about famines as slow violence of necropolitics, which is that certain population, are being treated as dispensable, that that they can be killed, they can be controlled through acts of violence. And it is an act of slow violence, and it was used by Rob Nixon to talk about climate change and environment threats. It's a useful framework to talk about the temporality of famine. Remember, people don't die immediately. It takes months. It depends on your body. It depends on so much that death occurs, right? So how do we understand that? And finally, to conclude, I want to say that all of us are invested in this moment because we are watching it happening, and it becomes a kind of a moral duty to bear witness to it, although it is very hard to talk about it, because when we study famines of the past, one thing we notice is that there is so much stigma, there is so much shame, there is so much post-colonial aspects of why certain famines are commemorated and certain are not. But not just commemorated in the sense that we think about them not occurring again, but we think about memorializing them in the interest of justice and peace. And I think we have to do that more so as we witness this, to talk more and more about it. As I told you that I'm not talking about this, although I've worked on it. It is so disturbing that it's very hard to talk, Sam, but when you said, and when I looked at the profiles of people, I thought, we can collectively bring some of these thoughts together and discuss. So I'm very, very grateful to all of you and for Sam to invite me to this, and to all of you who've shared your insights. And it's a moment where we are all bearing a very tough witness. I'll stop here. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much, Swati. That you conveyed so much in such short time, and we are very, very lucky to have you here and to engage in this discussion. You can probably all see each other now, hopefully, all the speakers. Do you have any questions or comments for each other? And I would invite the audience to add questions or comments in the chat as well.
I actually wanted to make a quick comment, but I'm very aware of the time, so I'm going to try to be as quick as I can to allow for some time for Q&A. I wanted to first start by acknowledging the presentations we've just heard. They struck a deep chord with me because so many of the patterns described are the same ones we see in Sudan and many other places. The interconnectedness that Swati highlighted there.
Oh dear, we've lost. Let me see if I can get her back on. Everyone keep talking. Sorry, that was such an important moment. Let me just see what happened to Sarah, and I'll just get her. Would anyone else like to fill the silence while we wait? Sorry about that.
Yes, I haven't raised my hand, but I thought that the one thing that I missed talking about is the whole idea of talking about famines is that they don't lose, we don't lose sight of accountability in all of this, right? When we think about war and violence, we are always thinking about who does it, who is the perpetrator. And in this project and beyond, we have all been investigating who do we hold accountable, right? Who is to be taken to the international court? Who is to be tried for war, for famine crimes, as has been used by certain scholars? So, how do we, through our discussions, think about treating famine, starvation, death as an act of crime against humanity for which people can be tried? So, just to recenter that word, accountability, in our discussions, accountability and justice. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I was going to say that I wanted to mention, but I didn't really get to it, which is that, with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, now we have American mercenaries on the ground in Gaza. And it's not clear, what's their role, who are they? I mean, we know that, some of the companies that contract them, but it really speaks to how humanitarian aid is being militarized and how so swiftly the United Nations and the more liberal organizations that are part of like the liberal international community were sidelined and replaced by this very direct colonial mechanism. So it really tells us a lot. And also in Gaza, we see, the massacre of aid seekers. So while we're speaking of course, we should be speaking about that too, that the aid seekers, those who are being subjected to famine, are being sadistically targeted and sniped by whoever's supposed to be the aid giver. So there's lots there that I think, people are giving commentary about, and I think we should be sensitive and attentive while we're responding to it, to try and understand as much as we can, and to center the people in Gaza who are really the first witnesses, and who are telling us what's happening, because yeah, it's happening in secrecy, and it's happening through American and Israeli, um, teaming up. So it's quite hard, to get insight onto what's going on.
Fantastic. Sarah, do you want to respond and also finish what you were saying? Sorry, just to get back to you. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I lost a bit of the discussion. My battery died. So I just wanted to continue on, and I think it continues on from what you were just saying, especially around the dehumanization. I began my presentation with stories rather than statistics, even though I can provide heaps of statistics, because numbers alone can't capture a person's dignity or the weight of their loss. Dehumanization happens when people are reduced to data points, and when their lives are treated as an abstract crisis instead of as mothers, fathers, children, and communities just like ours. And I know this because for years I joined meetings with donors and policymakers to advocate for funding and intervention to fight hunger. And every time we were asked the same questions: how many people are affected? What's the threshold? Is the situation really bad enough? Entire communities. Suffering was reduced to whether the number met a line on a graph. And often by the time the thresholds were met, it was already too late for too many, and funding was still not available. So we see this dehumanization in how the world responds to Sudanese and Palestinian people, and also in Congo and Haiti and many, many other countries. Their suffering is often framed as inevitable, as if war, famine, or displacement are simply part of who they are and their circumstances that they're used to, rather than being a result of choices and systems that could change, and that governments have the power to intervene and change. This narrative strips away humanity and makes it easier for the world to just look away. And part of that narrative hides the reality that the destruction of food systems is not accidental, which is what I think one of the presenters delved into really, really well. It is a deliberate tactic. In Sudan, Al Jazeera state, which is the country's food basket, was systemically targeted by RSF, and there's a lot of articles that you can find about that they've burned fields, looted harvests, and displaced entire farming communities. And we're seeing similar tactics used in Gaza that also were alluded to in a lot of detail today, where farmland and markets and food warehouses have been bombed and blockaded. So when food systems are destroyed, communities are weakened, and when parents are hungry and worried about how to feed their children, they cannot organize, they cannot fight, they cannot resist, and hunger becomes a weapon. So I just wanted to delve into that to just really clarify why and how it's used as a weapon. So this is why we must call this out for what it is. This is why solidarity is important again and again. We need our governments to publicly condemn the weaponization of food, demand protection for farms, markets, aid convoys, humanitarian corridors, and insist on full humanitarian access in both Sudan and Gaza. At the same time, we need to invest in rebuilding these food systems so that people can feed themselves again and regain their independence. The amount of destruction that happened in Sudan and Gaza is beyond repair. So unless we start planning now, there's no hope in seeing any future. And we must understand that solidarity is the antidote to dehumanization. It is not about pity or charity. It's about equality. It's about standing shoulder to shoulder and saying, your life is as valuable as mine. Your child's future is as important as my child's. True solidarity can sometimes feel uncomfortable. It asks us to challenge bias, to call out double standards, to have difficult conversations with friends, family, and even politicians, but it's also deeply human and simple. It can be as small as amplifying the voices of those affected so they can speak for themselves, showing up to a rally, writing to your MP, refusing to be silent when certain lives are treated as disposable. And history has shown that this works. Global solidarity movements helped end apartheid in South Africa, pressured governments to stop atrocities in East Timor, and shifted policies during the civil rights movement. So when enough people stand together and refuse to accept dehumanization, those in power are forced to listen. So because solidarity is about dignity. It's about making it impossible for the world to look away. It's about understanding that our freedom, our safety, and our futures are bound with one another. And then we act from a place of shared humanity. So we don't just save lives, we build a world where every life is valued equally. And that is the world that we deserve to live in. And I'm sorry, I feel like I've just been blabbering on, I can't stop, but I'm just really passionate about this subject, and I hope that I was able to get the points I was trying to get across in a way that's simple and hopefully memorable in a way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I've just left the silence there for other speakers or any of the participants. You'll see that there are questions. We probably don't have time to address all of these really important and profound questions coming from the audience. We've got 5 minutes to go, and I think what this tells me is that we need more time. We need to gather more frequently with like-minded people who have these types of perspectives, who can articulate and put into words what so many of us are feeling. And this idea of solidarity and coming together, particularly in grief and rage, I think is so important at this time. So I'm going to hand over the last 4 or 5 minutes to the participants and ask you what you would like to leave us with.
I'm yeah, jump in. Say that I think one important point was what Swati was saying about the survivors of famine and the way that they commemorate what they were subjected to. And I think that's relevant to our context within the Australian colony because we see the way that the ongoing genocide against Indigenous people continues to be perpetuated through health, right? And through resources. So and the control of land. So these are, I mean, people call them legacies, but really it's more than legacies. These are ongoing active systems. And I think, you know, the Israeli regime learns a lot from the existing settler colonies and in what it's trying to do in Gaza. I mean, and it's quite brazen that it wants to do this right now in 2025. But this is what's going on. So I think there's lots for the populations who are subjected to this very like the Palestinians have much to learn and connect with the native indigenous peoples across the world who've taught us a lot about survival and about resistance when that goes on for years and centuries and decades and it really just speaks to the criminality of what is happening right now. And the way that this famine everywhere is such a criminal act, and that it leaves impact that can't. So when Sarah was speaking about statistics, like you can't, it's not something you can really count. Like the impact is everlasting until there is justice and accountability.
Yeah, I think I'll build off what Tasnim said there around what can be learned across survival in the colonial context. I mean, I look a lot at like Australia, but every time I read something that's happening in Palestine, Sudan, Congo, there's a clear, a pattern that's being used or a kind of blueprint that's being used of like how food can be weaponized. And I think this goes back to the point around like survivors of famine aren't passive kind of objects that are just letting this happen. And you can look to kind of, not only just history in Australia, but like what's happening more now with how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are kind of revitalizing food practices as a way to kind of actively resist against the continued occupation in Australia. And that can then, their lessons and kind of ways of kind of solidarity across these borders because there's shared kind of occurrences that are happening. And so it's not just something that, oh, well, this is just an inevitability. Famine will occur and it's just something that happens. But we can see like people are able to kind of resist through it and reenact kind of their own sovereign governance and self-determination through, the very kind of basic reality of eating certain foods or growing certain foods. It's just those daily practices. I think that's really important. And that's something that we can kind of help support through our solidarity and kind of making those voices and stories visible through, sharing those stories. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Swati or Sarah, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, I was just trying to articulate something for something as a response to what Samit posted here about how do we effectively and ethically hold different temporalities of hunger in the same political frame. Anyways, it's a big, complex question, but I wanted to link it to some of the things that we have been thinking about. Is how there are links in linkages in the way in which we are understanding starvation deaths of the past and the present. The past, of course, is a way we understand the present, but when we look at how certain kinds of starvation is even among starvation is prioritized, has been talked about, diasporic interventions, global attention to it, and how some have been erased. And I'm so glad, Sam, that while Gaza is so important to the moment that we're living through. But I'm so glad we talked about Sudan, because that, as we said, there are Yemen we are not talking about, and other kinds of starvation that we are watching. I mean, people, for example, living in India, I know a lot of conversation as this economy doing well and tariffs and all that, but I do watch hunger here as well. It's not as if, hunger has been erased, perhaps at a different scale. But I'm just talking about how there are interconnections. And one point that was, solidarity has to be built through talking about all of them, through which this idea of accountability has to be pointed. I mean, famine occurs because of many different reasons, and of course, climate plays a role, and all of that we've heard. There are disasters, agricultural disasters, but how those histories have been wiped out. Let me give you one tiny example, and I'll shut up. The whole story of the Bengal famine. We kept hearing we didn't produce enough. The soil was bad. Bengal had a famine, till you realize that all of the food produced was deliberately sent by the Churchill administration to England so they could support the war efforts of England while one of the colonies starved. 3 million people starved. But, the people in Britain had to be saved and protected because there was a war going on and they needed food. So that history is being rewritten. Scholars are paying attention to it and not just saying that, soil was the big reason. There was no produce. So we have to think about how we change the language of talking about hunger, deaths, and starvation. Enough of crisis and disaster and climate and environment and soil. Let's talk about it as violence and war crime and famine crime. I'll stop here.
Thank you. That is a perfect place to stop. I want to thank all of our speakers and also acknowledge what it took for all of us to get here, to be able to speak here. We've all individually, I just want to say this because not to uplift ourselves, but I know from speaking to each of you individually and texting, we've all come to this space with other really important things that are going on in our lives. And because this is so important and because it is so urgent, there is no other option but to speak about this, to speak about what we do next, to speak about it as political violence. And most importantly, in the context of Australian and other universities around the world, to speak about it, full stop. I will end there. Thank you so much. And thank you for the lovely audience. There's a lot of interest in this, and I will share everything that was shared in the chat and a recording as well. I will wrap up and say thank you, and we will find a way to continue this conversation as well. I know that many of you do want to continue it.